Solo Leveling by Chu Gong. Chapter 39 Part 2 The Applicant. As Jinwoo sank into the shadow, he could see the same thing happening to Hain. I knew it. Jinwoo's suspicion was correct. After using Shadow Exchange several times, he formed a theory about the true nature of the skill, and he had been proven right. Shadow Exchange created a gate, as evidenced by the fact that he and Hain were passing through together. The shadow on the ground serves as an entry point, with the exit being the destination, and the coordinates of the exit were determined by a soldier's location. The fact that he could create an actual gate, albeit with a 3-hour cooling-off period between uses, was amazing news. This meant that if he put his mind to it, he could travel back and forth from the other side of the planet every 3 hours. Jinwoo swallowed at the revelation. His surprise didn't last long, though. The darkness soon gave way to light, and before they knew it, Jinwoo and Hain arrived at the gym. Jinwoo had left a shadow the last time he was here in the event he'd ever need to get to the association in a hurry. CHK, CHK. CHK, CHK. The lights started to turn on as the sensors detected their mana, making the gym quite bright. Hain could see the brightness through her shut eyes, so she opened them. How? She couldn't help but be shocked. They were somewhere with which she was very familiar, but it felt like her surroundings had changed in the blink of an eye. How is this possible? Hain had no idea such a skill existed. Amazed, she looked around, before her gaze settled on Jinwoo. You? She had a lot of questions, but couldn't bring herself to ask them. She wasn't even sure how to articulate them. Besides, they were way too close together to have a proper conversation. You're safe now, so? Jinwoo let go of her wrist and waist. No need to hang on to me. Hain could only nod in silence as she rubbed the wrist Jinwoo had been gripping. Let's start. Jinwoo moved away from the corner where his high orc soldier had been hiding and walked to the center of the gym. Yes! As she joined Jinwoo, Hain realized she'd left her sword in her car. Despite it being essential to her work, she couldn't very well bring a sword to a job interview. She told him as much. I left my weapon in my car. Oh, you mean the pickaxe? Excuse me? You know, the one you were holding in the high orc dungeon. Hain flushed at the embarrassing memory she'd forgotten about. No, my weapon is. It dawned on her that he was teasing when he giggled. Jinwoo waved it off after taking in her red face. I'm only kidding. Enough joking around. But now what? Hain was great, but there was no way she could take on the soldier he had in mind with her bare hands. While Jinwoo wanted his soldier to win, he didn't want her getting hurt either. Don't worry about it. Hain looked toward the equipment room of the gym. They should have something I can borrow. Oh! Jinwoo's eyes twinkled at this bit of information. Hain walked over to the door and swiped her hunter's license on the keycard reader next to it. The door swung open to reveal spare weapons that seemed very useful stored in rows inside the room. Jinwoo was amazed by the readiness of the Hunters Association. I didn't know they had something like this. Jinwoo had always wondered how the association dues were spent, but it looked like they put the money to good use. Hain inspected the weapons inside and came out wielding a sword similar in length to her own. I'm ready. Are you going to be okay with that? It's not your sword, so you might be uncomfortable with it. Hain shook her head. It doesn't matter what weapon I use. It's not like magic beasts attack hunters based on how they're armed. That was true. Jinwoo didn't object, since he fully agreed with that sentiment. He appreciated her straightforward nature. I guess it's time to summon a soldier. As if to show that she truly was ready, Hain released some of her mana. If Jinwoo summoned a regular soldier to oppose her, she would tear it in half in no time. So he played the best card he could. Come out. A smaller shadow separated from Jinwoo's own, and after moving several paces to the side, a knight noiselessly emerged. His armor and helmet were jet black except for the waist-length red mane attached to the top of the helmet. It was Igris, the best swordsman in Jinwoo's shadow army. I told Hunter Cha that I'd summon my strongest soldier, but Jinwoo thought summoning Baru would be going too far. Every member of the Korean team had been completely terrified of what Baru had been before becoming Jinwoo Shadow's soldier. Hain herself had been sent to the brink of death by him. Jinwoo didn't want to potentially traumatize her, so he couldn't bring himself to summon the Shadow Ant. Vaughn was out, since there would be a real danger of him burning down the gym. Consequently, Jinwoo had landed on Igris. You're the only one I can count on. Looking at Igris's imposing figure, Jinwoo was certain he had chosen correctly. However, Mr. Sung, Jinwoo turned to Hain. How will you determine a win or a loss? Hain's voice was cold enough to freeze the heart of anyone who heard it, and it made Jinwoo start to second-guess his choice. He deliberated his answer before suggesting, let's say the test will last either until my minion gets destroyed or you surrender. Hain nodded in agreement to the proposed conditions and brandished the sword she'd taken from the equipment room. Even though she was wielding a blade of average rank that could be easily purchased anywhere, the energy coming from it because of her was incredible. She's definitely strong. Jinwoo could sense that Hain, who stood with the best of the best S-rank hunters, had resolved to give it her all. Igris drew his swords, holding one in each hand. Jinwoo had an inkling that Igris might actually lose to Hain. But then, wait a minute, she said the weapon doesn't matter, right? Jinwoo smiled and addressed Hain. Could you please turn around for a second? Hain was baffled but turned as requested without protest. Jinwoo took the Demon Monarch sword from his inventory and handed it to Igris. Use this. She'd said it didn't matter what kind of weapon she used, so that should also mean it didn't matter what her opponent used. Igris was so moved that the master himself would grant him a sword that he was about to kneel in gratitude, but Jinwoo abruptly stopped him. I told you, you don't need to be so formal all the time. If only Iron had at least half of Igris's manners. In any case, Jinwoo called to Hain. We're ready. Hain turned and spotted Igris holding a sword crackling with blue electricity, something he hadn't been holding earlier. Shall we start? Jinwoo asked to proceed without addressing the change in weaponry. Yes. Hain reluctantly assented. Then begin. With that, Igris made the first move by swinging the Demon Monarch sword. Boom! A bolt of lightning flew straight at Hain. She flinched but managed to avoid the blast as nimbly as a cat by bending her torso backward. Krakum! The bolt struck the wall, leaving a blackened scorch mark. Hain straightened up and glared at Jinwoo, but he avoided eye contact and put on an innocent face. Hain wordlessly gripped her sword with both hands. As she did, Igris charged her at a terrifying clip, intent on making her surrender as ordered. However, Hain didn't bat an eye as she threw herself at Igris. President Go's office was situated on the highest floor of the main association building. From this vantage point, he could see all the association buildings as well as the surrounding area. He had been reading confidential reports when something outside his window caught his attention. Lights were on in the supposedly empty gym. Confused, Gunny buzzed his secretary. You called, sir? Did someone rent out the gym for the day? I don't see a booking, sir. Really? Gunny covered the receiver with his hand and sorted out his thoughts as he stared at the gym. He then spoke in a low voice. Turn on the surveillance cameras and put the feed on my monitor. Yes, sir. Soon, the TV that took up an entire wall of his office showed Jin Woo and Hain in the gym with their arms tightly wrapped around each other. Ahem. Surprised, Gunny coughed. No matter how many times he checked, it was definitely them. He cocked his head. Are those two in a relationship? But if he thought about it, when Hain had initially come to in the helicopter, the first person she'd asked about was Jin Woo. I should have seen it. Gun, he was smiling fondly as he watched the two hunters on the screen. They both hated calling attention to themselves, to the point where they'd requested that their personnel files be sealed as soon as they became S-rank hunters. However, by this point, everyone in Korea knew who Jin Woo was, and the same could be said for Hain. The only place such a couple could spend time alone was in the association gym after hours. For youngsters like them to have a date at the gym of all places. What a sound relationship they must have. Gun, he continued grinning as he shook his head a few times. He paged his secretary again. I'm sorry, but could you please turn off the surveillance cameras in the gym? Sir? But note in the records that there was a maintenance check today. Understood, sir. The TV turned off as soon as he hung up the phone. Gun, he gazed at the gym for a moment, then chuckled as he returned to his reports. But then, RRRMBL. The water in Go's glass rippled as a slight quake emanated from the gym. Ah! He didn't bother to look, but the smile on his face remained. Oh, to be young again indeed. Oh boy. Jin Woo massaged his temple at the growing headache. He appeared to have underestimated Hain. Although Jin Woo had bestowed the Demon Monarch sword to Igris, Hain was still proving too much for the night. Jin Woo called off the match as soon as she severed Igris's left arm. Stop! While they could respawn, it wasn't pleasant seeing his soldiers get destroyed. Huh? Hain exhaled hard to get her breathing back under control. Though she'd won, Igris had been tough enough that she was drenched in sweat. She wiped some of it from her brow with a pale, thin finger. It was unfortunate, but Jin Woo summoned Igris back, easily accepting the defeat. I lost. Vmm. Igris returned to his shadow. However, Hain didn't lay down her sword. No, this one doesn't count. She was invalidating the match? But why? Hain continued. You said you'd choose your strongest minion, didn't you? She approached him until there was only one step left between them. Was that Black Knight really your strongest? It was a rhetorical question. It was obvious she was just looking for confirmation of something about which she was already certain. When Jin Woo shook his head, Hain immediately answered. Then please summon your strongest minion as promised. You might get hurt. That's okay. I've wanted a rematch. Jin Woo's eyes widened. You know? Hain nodded. I've seen the footage. Hain had watched the video of the raid several times, and one of the magic beasts that used fire seemed familiar to her. That fire-breathing minion was the High Orc Shaman, the boss of the A-rank dungeon, wasn't it? Hain had surmised that with Jin Woo's abilities, it stood to reason he could do the same with the monstrous ant. She'd agreed to this test assuming that he would be her opponent. This one means nothing. Hain wanted to prove her mettle to Jin Woo by winning against the minion who used the monstrous ant's power. Jin Woo considered this briefly and then nodded. Baru. A shadow soldier whose entire body was cloaked in smoke appeared behind him. Hain instinctively stepped back at the sight. The shadow ant possessed an incredibly terrifying energy, just like before. Jin Woo was genuinely worried about Hain, whose face had turned pale. Are you sure you'll be okay? Although Baru was currently weaker than when he was alive, he was still a creature born to kill hunters. Hain pressed her lips together in a straight line and silently nodded. Baru, who'd been watching her, turned and bowed to Jin Woo. "My king, what would you have me do to this human?" Hain simply watched and waited as Baru wordlessly communicated with his master, almost as if she, too, could hear him. Jin Woo replied telepathically to him. "Defeat her without hurting her." "As you wish." The former ant-king turned shadow soldier faced the apprehensive warrior. Gulp. Hain swallowed hard. The enormous amount of magic power she felt from her opponent was giving her goosebumps. Jin Woo took this magic beast down? While Icarus hadn't fazed Hain a bit, she was now shaking like a leaf. With his preparations to do his king's bidding complete, Baru let out a savage battle cry. Scrawl! Blade-like claws extended from the tips of his fingers, but Jin Woo gave him a sharp look. No claws. Baru retracted his claws immediately, in high spirits. Jin Woo gave the order one more time. "Hurt her, and you'll be in a world of hurt yourself." "I shall do as you command." With Baru's answer in hand, Jin Woo announced the start of the match. "Begin!" Baru made the first move. He had been given a single command: defeat the enemy without hurting her. As one who had experience giving orders, Baru knew how to interpret Jin Woo's. Overwhelm her with a display of strength and make her lose her will to fight. Z-Mim. Hain lost sight of Baru for a split second, and before she knew it, he appeared in front of her. In that brief instant, despite being stunned by Baru's speed, Hain felt her reflexes kick in, and she struck him with her sword. She got in a few dozen attacks, but Baru avoided everything while keeping his feet glued to the same spot. His moves were precise without a single unnecessary action. He was so quick that he was a blur of afterimages. The power gap between them was unmistakable. This doesn't make sense. Hain was in disbelief as her strikes kept missing. How can he dodge at this close of a range without taking a single step? She tried once more. Hain aimed at her opponent's neck, but he easily avoided it by leaning back slightly. No matter which direction she came from, no matter how much she changed up her attack pattern, her target moved out of harm's way with ease. How? Baru wasn't even a real magic beast, but a minion who was borrowing a dead magic beast's power. How could he be so strong? And how strong is Jin Woo to control this minion so easily? Hain's attack slowed at the dim terror she was feeling. Baru took the opportunity to swat her sword swings aside with the back of his hand each time, before finally getting up in her face. Hain was stunned by the stench of death that abruptly flooded her nose. It's over. As soon as Baru's wide-open mouth filled her vision, she couldn't help but let out a scream. Ah! Instead of crushing her head with his jaws, the minion let out a terrifying roar. Scraw! The magic power contained in Baru's roar pushed Hain back. Eek! Jin Woo grimaced. He couldn't find any enjoyment in watching such a one-sided fight. And yet, Hain got back up and adjusted the grip on her sword as if she had no intention of surrendering. Jin Woo raised an eyebrow. What's going on in her head? Hain wasn't some low-rank hunter who couldn't accept a huge difference in power between her and her opponent even after witnessing it for herself. She's not reckless enough to rush into a fight she's got no hope of winning, either. Then did she have something up her sleeve? I hope she knows what she's doing. Jin Woo's psychic bond with Baru allowed him to sense the strength of the murderous intentions the shadow and was suppressing. Meanwhile, Hain's will to fight was as indomitable as ever despite her obvious disadvantage. Jin Woo had an ominous feeling. A solemn expression came across his face as he observed the two fighters. Baru couldn't understand Hain's decisions. He had put the huge power gap between them on display several times, so why wouldn't she surrender? The king of the ants, who ruled the top of the food chain, began feeling irritated at this human female who was but a mere plaything to him. His memories of being a dominant power fueled Baru's rage. How dare she? Baru materialized right in front of Hain, leaned in, and looked her in the eye. Any two living beings could tell through eye contact alone which of them was predator and which was prey. Her instincts should scream warnings at her. Baru's plan was to make Hain lose her will to fight by waking up her basic instincts. But it didn't seem to have worked. As Jinwoo suspected, Hain still had a card left to play. The move Hain was most confident at was a skill called sword dance. She moved progressively faster and faster, drawing elegant arcs in the air with her blade as if dancing. Clang, clang, clang. However, as Baru continued to block Hain's fluid and relentless strikes with his claws, his displeasure grew apparent in his expression. Enough playing around. With his bare hand, Baru grabbed the sword coming right at him and shattered it. Crack! Half the blade broke off. Despite the setback, Hain's eyes blazed with a cold fury. I have one shot at this. She focused all her magic power on what remained of the sword in her hands. This particular skill was called Sword of Light. This was her first time revealing this skill. Because it consumed too much magic power, she could use it only as a last resort. The blade shone brightly. Baru had lowered his guard after breaking her sword, so she leaped toward him and thrust her weapon forward. Jinwoo was utterly astonished. No! Naturally, he hadn't been worried about Baru, but before he could do anything, the sword pierced Baru's midsection as it shone with a gold light. Scraw! In that fleeting moment, one thought struck Baru. She's the enemy. Baru wasn't concerned for his own mortality. But if he fell, this woman's sword would be pointed at his king. And so, the basic instinct that all the Shadow soldiers possessed, the prime directive imprinted in all their minds, came to the forefront. Protect my master. Baru's mind reset, and Jinwoo's command to defeat the enemy without hurting her was wiped from his memory. Baru underwent a terrifying physical transformation for the sake of protecting his master. His body grew, his jaws became strong enough to chew through iron, and his sharp claws extended. Stop! Baru was primed to tear apart the enemy of his king with his 10 deadly claws. Swipe! Just as his claws neared Hain's body. TMP! Jinwoo narrowly made it in time. I said stop! He glowered at Baru while holding on tightly to both sets of claws with his bare hands. Baru trembled as his eyes met Jinwoo's. Without bothering to pull the sword out of his stomach, he leaped back and dropped to the ground face first, begging for Jinwoo's forgiveness. And my king, please show me mercy. Jinwoo understood why Baru had acted this way, since his instincts to protect his master had been loud enough to telepathically reach him. Jinwoo momentarily glared at Baru before looking to the side. Whump! Hain collapsed to the floor, having no energy to remain standing after staring death in the face, however briefly. Are you okay? As Jinwoo approached, Hain tried to rise but gave up. She could only look down at the floor and nod. Yes! She wasn't very convincing. Jinwoo helped her to her feet and asked, Why are you pushing yourself to your limit? There's no need to try so hard to join our guild, is there? It was only a test. What was more, it was a kind of entrance exam designed to prevent her admission. But she had been so obsessed with winning the match that she'd gone so far as to unleash an incredibly dangerous skill. This couldn't just be about a desire to win. So, I have to ask. Jinwoo proceeded with caution so as not to upset her. Do you have a thing for me or something? What? She seemed dazed, like someone had slapped her upside the head, So Jean Wu shrugged. Is that not it either? But then, Hain organized her thoughts before revising her response. Yes, I think so. At the Hunter Command Center of the United States, the director wasn't pleased with the news that his men had failed to recruit Jean Wu. He was waiting to hear the details directly from the assistant director instead of receiving a paper report. The assistant director arrived at his office with Norma. What happened? The director demanded before they could even take a seat. This was the first time anyone had turned down a recruitment offer involving Norma in the history of the Hunter Command Center. Michael stood with a gloomy expression and lowered his head. I am so sorry, sir. I didn't call you here for an apology. The director pressed a button that locked the door and covered up the glass walls of his office. The room was totally soundproof now. They took measures to avoid leaks regarding Norma, including refraining from using phones or emails for matters involving her. So the director still had no idea what exactly had occurred in Korea. What happened over there? Michael looked at Norma. She slowly nodded, and only then did. Michael speak. Mrs. Sellner observed Hunter Sung. And? The director understood how Norma's power worked, so the result of her observation was as important as the result of their recruitment efforts. According to Mrs. Sellner, Hunter Sung is. Michael licked his dry lips. A king. What? The director leaped to his feet. Out of all the strong hunters Norma had encountered, she had assessed only 3 as kings. The pinnacle of all hunters, each was powerful enough to shake up the global community, and Jean Wu had now been added to that short list. The director looked at Norma. Does this mean that Hunter Sung holds the power of a national-level hunter? She shook her head. Oh! The director furrowed his brow. Michael understood the director's reaction, as his had been the same. Norma let out a sigh. I should explain. She began without missing a beat. I know you're both aware of what my abilities entail. The director and the assistant director nodded simultaneously, and the director responded first. You said that awakened beings had connections to and could access the power on the other side. When Norma looked into the eyes of an awakened being, she was able to detect a passage connecting them to the other side. On rare occasions, the passage shone with a blinding light because the power coming through was that strong. Those were the aforementioned kings. So what's so different about Hunter Sung? He doesn't have a connection. Norma shivered. As soon as I looked into his eyes, the darkness in him looked back at me. Oh God! It was like looking at darkness incarnate. The assistant director argued, but he's helping tons of people as an active hunter. I don't think he's an evil person. If that was the case, Jean Wu would have instantly killed the 2 agents who had pulled their guns on him. However, the Korean man had easily let it go. Norma shook her head with a firm expression. It's not about whether Hunter Sung is good or evil. I'm talking about the source of his power. The director had been listening quietly to them with a hand under his chin, and he finally spoke up. But you're certain that he's a powerful hunter, right? Norma nodded. Hunter Sung doesn't get his power from somewhere else. His power doesn't come through the passage, but rather, it's within himself, so no connection limits his power. In other words, there's no limit to his power. Michael shivered as the words unintentionally tumbled out of his mouth. He couldn't wrap his mind around how powerful Jean Wu could become. The director was deep in thought after listening to everything. He eventually nodded as he came to a decision. Thank you, Mrs. Sellner. After seeing Norma off, he led the assistant director to the basement of the Hunter Command Center. Where are we going, sir? Sublevel 9. The filing room where documents are stored. There's more than documents down there. As he watched the elevator continue its descent, he continued, "If Mrs. Sellner's skill won't lure him here, we'll have to find something else that will." Jinwoo was young and possessed enormous power. If he was as impossibly powerful as Norma claimed, it didn't matter whether the source of his skill was lightness or dark. A knife held in self-defense would just be seen as a weapon by others. The director wanted to own the knife known as Jinwoo Sung. Upon arriving at sublevel 9, the director unlocked the door and ventured inside. A few employees greeted him as he passed, but he didn't even acknowledge them. "Do you remember the first S-rank gate?" Of course. How could Michael forget the horrific dungeon break that crippled the western part of the United States? The government had offered the best hunters in the world a handsome reward to get rid of the boss of that S-rank gate, and they'd succeeded. However, only 5 hunters survived the ordeal. One magic beast had killed off dozens of the world's best hunters. Without their sacrifice, the country would have ceased to exist. Thus, they had granted the 5 hunters who'd saved the country all the rights, privileges, and powers the United States had to offer, giving each individual the same level of power and influence as the country itself. It was from this that the term National Level Hunter was born. The director uttered the name of the magic beast that had caused the worst disaster in history. Kamish the Dragon. Mage hunters claimed that Kamish meant an undying flame. The director entered the last room on this level and opened the safe inside, revealing a heavily secured rune stone. Michael was startled. "Is that?" "Yes, it is." The director smiled as he placed his hand on the tempered glass box housing the rune stone. "This is the rune stone that came from Kamish remains." After Kamish was defeated, 2 of the national level hunters had settled down in the United States, like a parting gift from Kamish. The United States had then established the Hunter Command Center and focused all their efforts on increasing the power of hunters, so as to avoid a repeat of that tragedy. That was about 8 years ago. Since there were no mage hunters among the surviving national level hunters, Kamish Rune Stone had been waiting a long time for a suitable master in the cold basement of the Hunter Command Center. A knowing smile came across the director's face as he gazed at the contents of the glass box. "Kamish will give this wonderful country yet another invaluable gift."